4 months ago, everything in my life changed. My world came crashing down when my husband passed away, and I'm still trying to come to terms with it. Writing this, it still doesn't feel real. It's like he's still here with me, and every morning I wake up hoping it was all just a nightmare that I'd wake up from. It happened so suddenly. One minute, he was home from work, and the next, he collapsed in front of me. I called for help immediately, but it was too late. I tried to do CPR, but I didn't know how. I had never been taught, and I didn't know what I was doing. My husband died in my arms. It was all over in just a few minutes. When the ambulance arrived, they confirmed what I already feared. He was gone. The police came next, asking me all sorts of questions. The medics took his body, and they told me they would need to do an autopsy because there was no obvious cause of death. I didn't hesitate to agree, even if they hadn't said it was necessary. I needed to know why. Why did this happen? My husband was just 33, young and healthy. It didn't make sense. I was in a daze after they all left. My emotions were all over the place. I was crying, talking to myself, even praying, something I'd never done before. But somehow, I managed to gather the strength to call my mother-in-law and tell her what had happened. It wasn't easy, and I wasn't expecting her to be kind. She never liked me, not from the start. I didn't know why. I had always been polite, always tried my best to be a good daughter-in-law. But no matter how hard I tried, she never accepted me. She ignored me at family events, made backhanded comments about me, and even criticized me for being there for my husband when he was going through a rough time. It hurt because I always thought I was doing my best. I never crossed her boundaries, but she never gave me a chance. My sister-in-law was just as cold, treating me like I was invisible. There were times at family gatherings when she would talk over me, and despite my husband's efforts to intervene, nothing changed. She wouldn't even acknowledge me when my husband called to inform her of big events in our lives, like our engagement. And when we decided to pay for our own wedding, my mother-in-law was offended, even though we had already planned it all. She was upset we didn't need her help, and it seemed like everything I did only made things worse. Then came the wedding. The night before, she humiliated me in front of everyone. She complained about how stressful everything had been, even though she had contributed nothing. The rehearsal dinner, which she promised to organize, was a disaster. What should have been a celebration turned into a collection of picnic tables and cold food. My mother-in-law's behavior continued to sour the day of the wedding, and it got so bad that we had to have my sister-in-law escort her out after she got drunk and made a scene. The fight between my husband and his mother that followed was intense. After that, the relationship with them deteriorated. Years passed without a word, and I thought things were finally quiet. But when my husband died, I had to call her again. When I told her, she didn't react with sympathy or even shock. Instead, she blamed me. She screamed at me, saying I killed her son and that I would pay for it. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't expecting comfort from her, but I never thought she would accuse me like that. I tried calling my sister-in-law to share the news, but she didn't answer. I was left to deal with it all alone. The next day, the doctor called me with the results of the autopsy. It turned out my husband died from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that blocked his main pulmonary artery. The doctor assured me that there was nothing anyone could have done. Even if help had arrived sooner, it wouldn't have made a difference. I called my mother-in-law to share the results, hoping she would calm down. But when I spoke to her, she seemed to settle a little. We agreed she would come to my house that evening to discuss the funeral and the will. But when she arrived, she didn't come alone. She had brought the police with her, the same officers who had come to my house when my husband passed. They recognized me right away, and that's when the chaos began. My mother-in-law accused me of murder. She told the officers that I had killed her son and planned it all. She thought they would arrest me right then and there. I stayed calm, and I showed the officers the autopsy results. They read it over and tried to explain to her that it wasn't murder. My husband's death was the result of a medical condition, nothing more. But she refused to accept it, calling the document fake and making a scene. The officers were patient with me, reassuring me that everything was fine. They left soon after, clearly seeing there was no crime. My mother-in-law was furious, threatening me with prison, but I knew she couldn't touch me. I had done nothing wrong, and the authorities knew it. The next battle came when it was time to plan the funeral. My husband and I had never discussed death. It was something we never expected to face so soon. We hadn't made any plans for something so final. Now it seemed like I had no choice but to prepare for it alone. It wasn't until a year later, as I sat reflecting on a past moment at a funeral, that a realization struck me. My husband had shared something during that time, something that would now come back to haunt me. He'd said that, when the time came, he wanted to be cremated, not buried. It was a thought I had held onto, planning to honor his wishes. But then there was my mother-in-law. She couldn't bear the thought of it. She insisted on a traditional burial, and when she found out about my plan, the argument began. You just want to get rid of my son's body, so there'll be no evidence left, right? You've planned this all along. Her voice was sharp, accusing. It was like a knife twisting with each word. My sister-in-law, who had been standing nearby, immediately joined in. You've been planning this all from the start, haven't you? To erase any evidence of what really happened? They both attacked, and my patience started to wear thin. Their cruel accusations were unbearable, but I held my ground. If you want to bury something of him, bury his ashes, I told them. The idea was absurd to them, but I didn't care. My mother-in-law, still fuming, threatened to sue me. The words almost made me laugh. I knew there was no legal basis for what she was saying. Then she accused me of allowing the hospital to butcher her son, meaning the autopsy. I stared at her, baffled. What do you mean? I asked. It was necessary, I explained. The hospital needed to understand why he died so suddenly. We had to know. But that wasn't enough for them. Sister-in-law immediately turned her focus to me. She accused me of causing his death, claiming that our marriage had been under too much pressure. I scoffed at her words. We're a two-income household with no children. We had no tension between us. What happened to him was a shock, and it had nothing to do with any so-called stress. As if that wasn't enough, the days following the funeral were filled with more arguments. The details of the service, the music, the location of the coffin, it all became a battle. My mother-in-law even tried to exclude people from attending, but I was firm. This is my husband's funeral. He would have wanted these people here, and no one is going to stop them from saying goodbye. Her resentment was clear, but there was nothing she could do. Then came the reading of the will. As the lawyer went through the document, it became painfully clear. Everything was left to me. The moment the will was read, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law exploded. They accused me of being a gold digger. You killed him for the money, they yelled, their words cutting deeper than I could have ever imagined. Their accusations weren't just hurtful. They were irrational, completely unfounded. I was still reeling from the loss of my husband, and now I had to endure their baseless attacks. I couldn't believe what they were saying. They seemed to believe that if he hadn't married me, he would still be alive. You're the reason he died, they insisted. I understood the pain they were feeling. A mother's grief is overwhelming, but I couldn't just let them attack me like this. I loved my husband too. It's not fair to blame me for his death, I told them, my voice calm but firm. I'm financially stable. I didn't need him to leave me anything, but he did because he loved me. So if you have an issue with that, keep it to yourselves. I won't sit here and let you use me as a scapegoat. After I said my piece, I made it clear. They could contact me when they had calmed down and understood how ridiculous their accusations were. But they didn't. 2 months passed in silence, a silence I was oddly grateful for. My parents, seeing the state I was in, moved in with me. I was afraid to be alone in the house. Every room, every corner reminded me of my husband. My grief was overwhelming. One evening, my dad gently suggested that I sell the house and move in with them. My mom agreed. They were concerned, but I couldn't bring myself to let go of the house. It felt like the last piece of him I had left. I wasn't ready to give it up. Then, one day, out of nowhere, my mother-in-law called. I was taken aback. After so many months of silence, she was reaching out. She asked how I was doing and how the house was holding up. I was surprised, but tried to keep the conversation civil. I told her how difficult it was, adjusting to life without my husband, the weight of his absence hanging over me like a cloud. But then, just as unexpectedly as her call had come, she dropped a bombshell. My sister-in-law had remarried. I was stunned. I hadn't been invited. My mother-in-law explained that they hadn't wanted to disturb me while I was still grieving. Then came the real shocker. She informed me that, since my sister-in-law and her new husband didn't have their own place, they were planning to move in with me. I was speechless. Are you serious? I asked. But no, she was absolutely serious. She explained that since my sister-in-law didn't have space at her own place, she thought it would be fine for them to move into my home. The weight of her demand hit me like a ton of bricks. I could barely form a response. I'm not comfortable with this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This is my house, not a guest house. But my mother-in-law was insistent. She reminded me that my husband had left the house to me, and since I was living alone, it was expected of me to make space for them. She even implied that if I wanted to stay part of the family, this was something I had to do. Frustration surged within me, but I didn't argue further. I was getting tired of fighting. Instead, an idea began to form. If they wanted to move in so badly, they could, but they would pay for their own bills. I wasn't about to let them live here for free. I kept the plan to myself for now, knowing my mother-in-law wouldn't approve. I simply agreed to her demand. I called my parents and told them about the plan. They supported me, and we began to prepare for the inevitable. Slowly, I started to pack up my belongings, preparing for a new chapter in this house. My parents made room for my sister-in-law and her husband, but the transition wasn't as smooth as I'd hoped. The task of transferring utility bills into my sister-in-law's name became my responsibility. I carefully contacted each provider, explaining that the house's occupancy had changed, and asked about the necessary steps to update the billing details. Forms were filled, details were changed, and everything was set for them to take over the utilities. When the day arrived, I handed over the keys to my sister-in-law and explained that, as a wedding present, she and her husband had the house all to themselves. My sister-in-law was thrilled, calling my mother-in-law to share the good news. My mother-in-law seemed pleased, relieved that her daughter and new son-in-law could live in peace without any disturbances. As I watched them celebrate, I couldn't help but think they believed I had given up the house entirely, letting my sister-in-law take full control. After that, I moved back into my parents' home. Their house still had my old room, and being back there felt strangely nostalgic. It was comforting to return to a familiar space, and I found I felt more at peace there than I had in my own house. But when the bills started arriving, addressed not to me but to my sister-in-law, it felt like a shockwave. The electricity, water, and other utility bills, each one in her name. Confused and clearly frustrated, she called me, demanding an explanation. I calmly told her that since she and her mother had wanted to live in my house, they would now be responsible for the bills. Before I left, I'd made sure to transfer all the utility accounts to her name, with the exception of the house deed. Her reaction was explosive. She erupted, shouting, blaming me for putting the financial burden on her. I scoffed at her tantrum and told her that if she didn't pay, the fines would come in her name as well. Her fury only escalated, and I couldn't help but smile as I watched her lose control. Not long after, my mother-in-law called, furious. She accused me of being unfair, demanding I cover the bills because, according to her, my sister-in-law and her husband were financially strapped and couldn't afford them. She suggested I pay out of the kindness of my heart. I stood firm. It wasn't going to happen. We argued for a while, not until she finally threatened that, because I refused to pay, her daughter and her husband were planning to move out. They simply couldn't afford the bills. I told her that if they moved out, I'd be more than happy to take my house back. She called me heartless, accusing me of prioritizing money over family. I didn't engage in her accusations, and she hung up in anger. But I felt relief washing over me. The tables had turned. What had started as a plan to inconvenience me was now a complete reversal. I hadn't just stood my ground, I'd made them realize their hypocrisy. Still, a small pang of guilt lingered. Was I wrong in this? A flood of comments came in, and the support from strangers on Reddit meant the world to me. After my husband's passing, I'd felt so alone, but reading stories from people who had gone through similar experiences helped me realize I wasn't as isolated as I had thought. Many asked why I'd even let my sister-in-law and her husband move in at all. To answer that, my mother-in-law is a difficult person to stand up to. She's narcissistic and manipulative, always insisting on having her way. And ever since the lawyer confirmed that the house had been left to me, I knew she had her eyes on it. My sister-in-law was just a pawn in her game, doing whatever her mother demanded. They probably thought that by getting me out of the house, they could just take over without facing any consequences. Now that my sister-in-law had moved out, she begged me to pay the outstanding bills. She claimed she had no money and couldn't afford the penalties. I agreed to settle the bill for the previous month, but made it clear that after this, the utilities would go back in my name. She would no longer be living in the house. I suppose she learned a hard lesson. 3 months later, I listed my house for sale. It wasn't an easy decision. Letting go of the house, filled with so many memories, was hard. But there was also relief. I could start over, somewhere far from my in-laws' grasp. Therapy helped me process all of the emotions tied to this decision, especially the grief of losing my husband. It hasn't been easy, and some days are still very difficult, but I'm slowly learning to accept the ups and downs. Therapy has been a refuge, a place where I can talk about my feelings without judgment. Having people around me who care, friends, family, has been crucial in getting me through this time. The house is officially on the market now. It feels like a new beginning, Even if it's bittersweet, I'm ready for whatever comes next.